Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're dialing in from. And I feel like I'm bringing a very old school topic here by talking about market research data. I'm Ramona. I'm a cultural researcher and strategist, and I've been working with multi-market research data for more than 25 years. And throughout my career, I've seen a lot of things go wrong with survey data. And when working with data scientists, I often found that they naturally look for the error in the actual coding of the data, but there are often multiple points of failure way before that, from questionnaire design to methodology selection, sampling. And it's very much the age-old problem of garbage in, garbage out. And survey data may be small data, but it's layered with complexity. And I'm going to take you through about 10 examples of where things can go wrong. All the data examples I'm showing are fictional, so don't get hung up on the numbers, because I know you're going to zoom in to them automatically. But these are all real situations I've encountered, all based on my experience. So let's start with our first red flag. Take a look at this education data from the US and Germany. I'm going to pick a couple of German examples because I'm German. I'm living in the UK nowadays, but I rather thought I'll pick on me. At first glance, you might think this looks reasonable. We've got a standard education classification system, but the problem is you're forcing a local education system into categories that simply don't exist. In Germany, associate degree doesn't exist at all. What happens is that vocational training, what we call Ausbildung, gets miscoded. Similarly, high school graduate is ambiguous because Abitur, which is what is needed for university entrance, is significantly more than just basic secondary school. And notice how the US distribution looks clean and neat. That's actually giving you a false sense that your data is comparable across markets when it absolutely isn't. This one is relatively easy to spot, but it matters here that you identifying that this is an error and not a finding. What it is harder is to fix this, as you don't know what option German respondents selected when they could not find an education level that fits. You can try collecting some education levels into broader groups and see if the distribution matches that from other data sources, for example, a census. But you can prevent it, and it's essential that you work with local experts to properly localize content, particularly when it's something as tricky as education. The second example or red flag that I've picked here tackles translations as the root cause. And this is something that will increasingly happen as people use AI translators instead of human native speakers. In this example, I've made the percentages for both cheap and tacky stand out in the data. The issue here is that both cheap and tacky were translated into the same German word, which is billig. So German respondents saw the same word twice in their attribute list and really didn't know which option to select. The correct German translation should have been either preiswert or günstig for cheap and kitschig for tacky. So this is a perfect example of why auto-translation tools can be dangerous for market research. They miss the crucial connotative differences between words that may seem similar, but carry very different meanings. Unfortunately, it's very hard to recover when translations errors were made, as respondents essentially answered a different question or had different options. Here, I would simply remove the data for cheap and tacky in Germany. To prevent this, it is best to have your translation double-checked by a native speaker. I would do this anyhow if this was done by AI or a native speaker in the first place. That is usually more expensive, but so is data that you just have to throw away. There's also an option of doing back translations into English, but you still risk missing nuance. Your survey data is only as good as who actually answers it. So red flag 3 is about who's in your data and how they got there. In this example, we are looking at a mobile banking study in Thailand. The research team used online panels for convenience and supplemented with some face-to-face interviews to broaden their reach. They set quotas on age and gender, which is the standard approach, but they completely ignored income levels. As a result, high-income urban respondents make up 40% of their sample when they represent only 15% of Thailand's population. This group show 85% mobile banking usage, which is dramatically higher than any other segment. This isn't just a demographic problem, it's directly driven by the methodology choice. Online panels naturally skew towards digitally connected, higher income segments who already use things like digital banking. Meanwhile, rural and lower income populations, who make up to 60% of the country, represent only 25% of the sample. When you mix online and face-to-face methodologies to try and fix a coverage problem, you actually create a new issue. Online panels are self-completion, while face-to-face is usually interviewed administered. So how you answer when a human being asks you questions is fundamentally different than when you just click on an online link. This is more than just two types of audiences. And failing to set quotas on variables that drive your key metrics allows methodology bias to dominate your sample. And trying to fix methodology bias by mixing data collection approaches creates audience profiles that don't represent any real population segment. You can fix this by applying population weights to the actual population on these metrics, but you risk these weights being quite high. But you really need to split the data into each methodology separately rather than combining them into very misleading averages. Number 4 is a coding error that can completely invalidate your results. Your dissatisfaction data shows the UK and Canada with 72 and 68% agreement respectively, but Germany lags behind at just 25%. The issue here is that someone reversed the Likert scale coding for Germany, where 5 should mean strongly agree, it was coded as 1, and vice versa. So German respondents who actually satisfied appear dissatisfied in your data. And this type of error is more common than you think, especially in multi-country projects where different programming teams may be working on different or multiple market surveys. To fix this, you can simply reverse the scale coding for the affected items and reanalyze. The underlying response data is still valid. Example 5 shows the impact of respondent fatigue and poor quality responses. The gray bars here show completely flat ratings across all attributes, which is a classic sign of respondents who stop paying attention and are just clicking on anything to finish the survey. This is also what we call flatlining. And you can identify them by looking at the standard deviation, which should be close to or equal to 0. Long, repetitive, boring surveys also lead to low effort responses. You'll also see this with speedsters who complete the survey in record time, which is usually in the top 10%. How tight you set the criteria is up to you, and they can be driven by how much data you realistically can exclude, because that's also a cost factor. The red bars show what the same data looks like after removing low quality responses, and suddenly you have more meaningful variation across the attributes. So the fix here is that you remove low quality responses based on predefined criteria. If you have longer surveys, you can also include things like attention checks or trap questions to prevent these respondents from getting into the data in the first place. Example 6 is a comparison between China and Germany data, which shows cultural differences in self-reporting. In this example, Chinese respondents report 35% weekly baby food purchases compared to Germany's more realistic 18%. When you see data like this, you will have already looked at other red flags like translation, coding errors, and found that everything is working as intended. Everything works correctly, and yet the data looks completely wrong. And this is something that I've seen particularly happen with surveys done in China, but it can happen in other markets as well. And this is more due to cultural reasons. This is aspirational overclaiming. Chinese respondents often report what they want to be seen doing rather than what they actually do. So this shows a social desirability bias and cultural tendencies towards aspirational self-representation. And it weirdly happens on things like baby food, buying cosmetics. I recently had a colleague who had a high overclaiming in China when it came to attitudes to and usage of generative AI. These are very difficult to present as they can happen in very weird and wonderful places in your data. You can identify the overclaimers in your data by setting up criteria for those who gave inconsistent answers throughout the surveys. For example, those who bought baby food but are not parents. But you risk losing 10% or more of your data if you start to exclude these people. Sensitive topics create massive underreporting issues, as this alcohol consumption data demonstrate. The UK shows 8 units report per week. Germany 7, Sweden drops to 4, and Saudi Arabia shows virtually 0 consumption. These differences don't reflect actual drinking patterns. They reflect cultural attitudes towards admitting alcohol consumption. In Saudi Arabia, where alcohol is illegal, respondents won't admit consumption regardless of actual behavior. Sweden shows moderate underreporting due to social desirability bias, whilst the UK has relatively open cultural attitudes towards alcohol. If you spot large deviations from expected patterns based on legal availability and cultural norms, then this indicates systematic underreporting. This is less about fixing the data, as there are no errors here, but more about understanding why this happens. Number 8 shows you tracking data, and this has an apparent improvement in satisfaction scores, but the improvement is artificial. Between quarters, someone changed the question wording from how satisfied are you to how happy are you? This is a subtle shift, but it moves from cognitive evaluation, satisfaction, to an emotional evaluation, happiness. So the 54 to 64 increase in top scores has nothing to do with the actual service improvement and everything to do with how people respond differently to emotional versus rational framing. This is not just limited to question wording, but can also happen when you change the answer options, either by removing existing options or adding new ones, or even change how you ask the question. When something has been significantly changed in how the question was asked on a tracking study, then this should become a new variable in your data. Otherwise, you're comparing apples and pears. Nearly there. For Flight 9, we're looking at satisfaction data. And here we ask about parcel delivery satisfaction using a 10-point scale across Mexico, Germany, and Japan. Mexico had a mean of 8, Germany 7, Japan a 6. This is the standard for something like a net promoter score. The crucial point here is that a 7 in Germany or a 6 in Japan might actually reflect the same underlying satisfaction levels as a 9 in Mexico. If you only look at the raw numbers, you'll wrongly conclude that Mexico has vastly superior delivery service. You can standardize between people in the country and also across statements. The first step is to look at the distribution of answers across statements for each country, for your satisfaction statements, as well as for other statements, to determine if there is a country pattern in how people use the scale. If there is, you can index individual responses over the mean score within their market, taking the mean score across the satisfaction statements. I personally prefer not to use this approach. Indexing scores within each country can be a useful way to reduce response style bias, but it has drawbacks. It risks erasing genuine differences in satisfaction between markets, assuming that scale use patterns are uniform across all items and relies on the item being interpreted in the same way everywhere. It also doesn't address differences in variance. Some countries use the full scale while others use clusters in the middle, which can distort comparisons. In other words, it's a pragmatic fix, but not a perfect one. Our final red flag involves misinterpreting what your data actually represents. This grocery spending data shows Germany at 297 euros per month, Spain at 222, and Greece at 181. At first glance, it looks as if Greece households are under-consuming, but that conclusion is misleading. Even though all 3 countries use the euro, the figures reflect very different household incomes, price levels, and cultural norms of foods purchasing. Higher spending in Germany reflects higher wages and living costs, but not necessarily buying more. In other words, the data isn't showing consumption, it's showing the economic and cultural context of grocery shopping behavior. There's nothing to fix here, but if you wanted to compare like for like, you can re-express the figures as a percentage of household income or adjust for purchasing power. Right, we've reached the end of the 10 different ways of how your market research data can go sideways. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any, Randy.
All right. Okay, so I'm gonna give them a second to put in questions. A lot of people were just commenting on oh, I've seen this horrible car crash before.
Oh, I've seen it way too often.
Oh man, when you had the flip scale, I was like, I know, I didn't even read the text. I'm like, I know what that chart is, and I've seen it. I hate it. Because yeah, I think a lot of us have seen variations of these. I know that the survey experts, like at work, we have survey experts, and I go bother them every time because the 10 things you listed and about 1,000 more are things that like you have to remember when you make a survey.
But the thing is, there are so many points of failure
Mhm.
across, and kind of the more levels of complexities you add by making a survey longer, adding more countries to it, having, funky, interesting, complicated things like a conjoint or a max diff or fun things like that, the more points of failure you're just adding.
Uh-huh. And then you have like a high executive that's like, oh, can I just add one more question? We spent 6 months validating the survey, but sure, you can just add your question at the end and totally ruin it. It'll be fine.
That should have been my red flag 11, stakeholder input.
Whenever you ask them, oh, can you review the survey, they treat it as an invitation to, can you add more questions to the survey? And then, okay, guys, come on, put some questions in here, or at least comments about, like, the chat is full of a lot of comments of things. So I'm just kind of citing stuff here, but okay, there's like 3 people talking, so I'm going to give them a chance to like finish it up. But let's see what else is going on with the. Oh, all right. So I think of these issues are also issues with HR people surveys, where the administrator is likely to not be an HR survey expert, and different parts of the org have very different sets of people. So, do you have any tips for someone who is like asking for help in this space, like doing these people surveys?
Um, so if it really depends on kind of how many countries you have. I would say if you're worried about, you can always pre-test. So that is a good thing. Of you write a survey, you give it to a handful of people, kind of who can be your testers. You can give it to different people in different countries, and they will very happily flag to you everything that you've done wrong. And doing something, even if you just give them a Word document with the questions, you don't even need to have it programmed in a fancy way. Another way is always looking at, you have a couple of surveys already completed, then you look at the data and you can spot early on if something's going wrong and then fixing it as well. So if you're not that experienced in writing surveys and doing this, if it's concern around writing questionnaires, ChatGPT and other generative AI LLMs, they can help you write something. They can also help you test something. So I have prompts that I use for stress testing questionnaires, and they can also help you spot when something is going wrong. So there are
Oh,
different ways of how you can tackle that, both using AI and human beings.
definitely. Oh, yeah. A lot of very common practice is to show it to another data person. Feel like here's a survey, and I think you and a lot of us do this, where I will take a survey not to want to respond, but I just want to see what the researcher is doing, just seeing what's going on.
It always helps to have someone who's not familiar with what you're doing, because everything you write is clear to you. And then
Mhm.
somebody else who doesn't have the context looks at it and points out everything that is just not clear to them. So that always
Mhm.
helps.
Definitely. Okay, there's another question here. At what point And how did you realize the red flags when working with the data? Is there a way you can salvage the data when you find these red flags?
It really depends. So I try to address it throughout, that sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. So really depending on how reliable the data is in the end. When it was something like Randy was saying, the flipped Likert scale, you can still do that because you have confidence in what was very satisfied and what was a very dissatisfied. So you can just flip it back in the coding. But other things, when something like a translation error, someone who completed the survey will have seen something completely different. And in that case, all you can do is throw away the data. If you didn't catch it early on, then you can still fix it. But the data that was had the translation error in, you can just not use it.
Mhm. All right. So one question, I know the answer is going to be it depends, but it's like, how do you manage comparing data across years when working with different survey vendors? For example, if an HR vendor changes one year across different parts of the company, but the data needs to be integrated in some way, how would you manage that?
So it shouldn't really matter which vendor you've been using. What is really essential is, are you comparing like for like? So have you got the same type of people in your data? So you usually have some sort of stratification approach by saying, I want to have so many males and females and different age groups in there. If you're doing that from an HR perspective, then you might approach it. You can still do like age and gender, but also different seniority levels to just say it's like for like. You can use a reweighting approach if the distribution is different across years, by reweighting previous data to what it's a weighting approach is essentially just adding a multiplier so that the distribution is the same everywhere. And you standardize kind of a data dictionary that you have so that every variable that was asked in the same way has the same labeling, even what was called in the previous vendor, it might have been called question 2. So, and in your new survey with the new vendor, it's called question 4. You're just making it the same label so that the data reads in the same. So it's just about standardization from a data perspective.
Mhm. Okay, so one last question here is, one of the things I've noticed in my line of work is that getting enough respondents is difficult. We can always incentivize the survey, but of course there's issues with that. So what strategies do you recommend to increase the number of respondents taking a survey to get better data?
That really depends on who you're getting in. So if you're doing it in things like the HR example, so you're doing something within the organization, then it's just good old pressure, complete this, it's mandatory. If you're doing something, an online survey, depending on what the source is, if you're using a panel vendor, you just increase your sources, really. You try different panels, different vendors. And if you're sourcing from something like social media, you go to different social platforms to get different types of people. If you're having really tricky groups, for example, teenagers who are usually not available on panels, you can also recruit via the parents and do something that we call snowballing. Is you ask the person who has already completed your survey if they know someone else who would fit the criteria of the survey, and enter an email address whether you can send the link to the survey as well.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much for your talk. You got a lot of things. Feel free to catch up on the chat. I'm sure people have other questions and stuff for you. But
Fantastic. Thanks for having me.